My name is Felicia. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and this is my way of raising awareness. My mother and father were divorced, and she remarried, and that's when my abuse started. I was 5, small things at first. He would, cuddle me, hug me. He loved to tickle me, things like that. And then over the summer, it kind of got worse. And that's when he started putting his hand under my clothes and feeling, and he would always say that feels great. You're doing so good. And he would always say, you're being such a good girl. So when I would refuse him, then that meant I wasn't being a good girl anymore. I would be in trouble for nothing. He would ground me just because I wasn't being a good girl. So this went on for 7 years. Over the years, the abuse continued to get worse. When I was around 8 is when I had my first at the hands of him. I didn't really even know what it was, but it became something that I used as a way to calm my anxiety. So it kind of became an obsession. I would even do it in school. I would rub against the seat in school. The teachers never questioned it. The teachers never paid attention to it. And I don't understand that. When I was 12 is when he raped me. He had asked me to go into their bedroom. My mother was working, and I remember telling him no. I said, I'm not going to do that. Well, that's when he grabbed me and he, pulled me into the bedroom. He threw me on the bed. He yanked my clothes off. I remember I was terrified. I started panicking, and I, asked him, like, what are you doing? Because he had never done that before. He put my arms behind my head. He told me, just lay there and shut up and, let him do what he was going to do. And he was just so heavy on me. He didn't stop. It seemed like forever, but I would probably say it was a few minutes in when I wiggled my way under his arm and I ran out of the room naked. Remember, I ran to my bedroom. I put, my clothes on real quick, and I left next door. And that day, I was thinking that my mother would see that I was different and would ask, what happened, but she didn't. She didn't, I don't know if she just didn't notice or if she was ignoring it. So most of my childhood, I was always shy. I was quiet. I still kind of am. I kept to myself. I didn't have many friends. Everybody thought that I was just a quiet kid when that really wasn't what it was. I was terrified all the time. I began having nightmares very young. I still do. I still have those nightmares. I'll wake up feeling like he's on top of me and I can't breathe, and I'm panicking, and that happens, I would say, on at least a weekly basis. Abuse went on for 7 years. When I was 10, I had a birthday party, and my mother had left to go pick up pizza, and he made me stay there with him. He was chasing me around the house because he wanted to have a little fun before the party, and I kept telling him, no, we're not. No, it's my party. I have friends coming over. And, when he kept saying, if you don't behave, then I'm going to tell your friends you're being bad, and we're not going to, you're not going to be able to have a party because you're being a bad girl. I remember because I stood there with my head down. I always had my head down. And I stood there for about a minute, hoping that the time would pass and somebody would show up. But, that didn't happen. So I remember I surrendered. I walked over to him and I stood there. He pulled my, shorts down. He picked up my shirt. I remember I was standing there because, of course, we're Christian. And in my mom's kitchen, she had the Last Supper wall hanging on the wall. And I remember I was staring at that the whole time, wondering why God wasn't saving me. Why was God allowing this to happen to me? And why wasn't he helping me? Where is God in all of this? Why is this happening? It should not be happening. But of course, he continued until he finished. And then, that's when I ran to the shower, changed and showered and stuff before everybody got there. After my friends and my mother came back, we were having the party. I remember that I was staring at him because he was eating his pizza with the same hand that he was using to touch me. I remember thinking, did he even wash his hands? I wasn't enjoying the party. I was never in the moment. I was always just thinking that something that had already happened. Did he wash his hands? I'm 45 now, and my brain is still somewhere else. It's never in the moment, which I'm working on that, but it's not easy because I feel like I dissociate a lot. Even, during intercourse with my husband, sometimes I'll notice that I'm staring into the corner or, my brain is just somewhere else. I don't really have control over it anymore. So the abuse happened for 7 years. After me, he did go on and abuse other kids, and then he served 13 years in prison, but now he's out free, and that's what made me want to tell my story and write my book and raise awareness, because I'm sure right now he's out looking for his next victim. So it was important for me to write my book and show the world what he did and, what he is. When I was 12 years old, our school counselor showed a video during our PE class, which was talking about childhood sexual abuse. During the video is when I realized that this wasn't normal. And I was in shock because my whole life I thought this was normal. I remember going to the bathroom crying, and my friend was with me, and she asked me, "Is that mean man touching you?" And I told her, "No, why would you say that? Like, of course not." Well, she already knew that it was happening because she had seen things going on around my house. Like, she would see him walking around naked and masturbating in the living room, watching. Like, he would do that with my friends over. And I would try my best to shield them from it, but I never could. The day that my school counselor found out, my friend reported it to her. And then, like, hours later, CPS showed up at my house, told my mother about it, and she kicked him out. So I never saw him again after that. She believed me, which is always my fear, because he would always say, "Nobody's going to believe you. You're nothing. You're nobody." I mean, yes, it was the sexual abuse, but it was verbal abuse. It was manipulation. It was all just combined. So I always thought that nobody was going to believe me. But when, CPS told my mother she did believe me, it was just a relief because she knew I wasn't lying. We tried to prosecute him, but at the time I was so shut down, I would not talk about it at all to anybody. Because of that, we couldn't prosecute him because the prosecutor or the DA said I wouldn't be a good witness because I wasn't able to talk about it. Nothing happened. And I tried to just, move on with my life, just ignore it. It's in the past. That's not how our brains work. So I couldn't move on. It was always there. Later on in life, when I was 23, my father passed away. And that's when I lost control over everything. I lost my marriage, my home, my job. I lost everything because I was falling apart. And I wish that I had known that when I was younger. If I had had successful counseling or something, it probably would have helped, but I couldn't talk about it at all. Nothing happened, and he continued to abuse other children. And I've always blamed myself for that, because if I had just been stronger when I was 12, he never would have crossed paths with this other family, and those other children never would have been abused. When I was 25, 2 years after my father's death, and I had spiraled down, my life was a mess. I knew that I had to do something to stop him because I knew that he was abusing other kids because that's just who he is. So I researched him. I found out where he lived. I found out his wife's name, and I drove 8 hours to speak to his current wife. And I told her my story. I told her that he abused me for 7 years. I told her everything that he did, and she told me that her children and grandchildren had been telling her stories, but she didn't believe them. And he told her that I was a mentally retarded little girl who wanted attention. When she saw me and we talked about it, I hoped she would know that that wasn't true, but she still said that she wasn't sure if she believed her children and her grandchildren. So I gave her my number and I told her, "Call me. If you're going to prosecute him, call me. I want to be there. I want to be a part of it." I never heard from her. But 4 years later, I found out that he was sentenced. He got 8 20-year sentences for aggravated sexual assault, indecency with a child. He got 20 years per charge, which seems like a lot of years, but he only served 13. He was approved for parole in 2020. In 2017, I got an email because I was registered as a victim saying that he was going to go in front of the parole board, see if he could get parole. I freaked out. So I wrote the parole board, and I wrote them a detailed letter of my abuse and how my abuse was never known because I was never strong enough to share it. But I told them my story, and I told them to please hear my story and to please not to let him out. He can't be out. He's not safe to be around children. So in 2017, his parole was denied. And then in 2020, I got another email. The email just said that he was approved for parole after he served 9 months in a sex offender rehab. So he had to complete a sex offender rehab course for 9 months, and then he would be released to the public on parole. So I kind of built strong walls around me. I don't think those walls will ever go away. Sometimes I think about it. Sometimes I think it's a good thing, and sometimes I think it's a bad thing because I don't let people too close to me. But at the same time, that means I can't get hurt. So when I was 25, during my divorce time, I had a hunch that my husband was cheating with another woman. Of course, it was just a hunch. They were friends, when we were at a Christmas party and I saw her, whispering in his ear. And in my head, I said, you're not going to hurt me. If anybody's going to get hurt, it's going to be you. So in my head, my thought process was, I'm going to hurt you first, and I'm going to hurt you harder than you could ever hurt me, which is what I did. Of course, left him from one day to the next. My heart was cold. I did not care what happened to him. That was the end of that. We reunited 2 years later. We're still together, but he never cheated on me. It was just all in my head. I don't trust people. That's what I did, which destroyed my marriage, and I lost my home, my job, destroyed my kids. It was a mess. When I was growing up, he never abused my mom. He was actually pretty good to my mom. Usually when I would visit, I was alone. My older sister did tell me one time that she was getting dressed and he was looking at her through the window. He was outside and watching her through the window while she was getting dressed. And she told my mom, but it kind of just got blown over. It was like nothing happened. It was just ignored. I don't think he abused anybody else in the home. It was only me. And I think it was only me because I was 5. I was the youngest. I craved attention from my mom. My mom and dad were complete opposites. It's like my mom was very loving and, emotional. My dad was kind of cold. He was not emotional. I really got a hug from him. So when this new man started, hugging me and cuddling and let's watch TV on the couch, it was great. Everybody would, crave the attention. But that was just the beginning of the grooming process. And then it just got worse after that. I think I was the most vulnerable one out of everybody. So when I was 5, the first thing I remember is I was in the tub. And I remember there was a lot of bubbles in there. And I was taking a tub bath. And he walked in saying that he was going to help me clean myself, which I said, okay. I know that dads bathe their kids too. So, okay. And that was actually, I think that's the day the abuse began, but he didn't touch me. He just bathed me and left the room. But after that, it became more of like, touch me here. And he would put my hand on his, said, do you like how that feels? And then he started touching me under my clothes. He would take my clothes off. And, that was during the summer before I started kindergarten. By the time I started kindergarten, which was months later, he would kiss my face, which to this day, I don't like kissing because he would lick my entire face. Like he would kiss my face from my nose down to my chin. I could smell his cigarettes. I could smell, his bad breath. It was just gross. And he continued to do that until I was 12. He would always kiss me on my lips. And I would seal my lips shut so I wouldn't let his tongue go in. But he would still, my lips were never strong enough. And he would still get his tongue inside of my mouth, make me gag. And we were about to move to a home in a town 10 miles away. He took me to the apartment to finish cleaning it out and to get, whatever stuff we still had in there. So we went, and when we walked in, the apartment was empty. Like there was nothing in it at all. So he laughed and he sat at, the other edge of the room, took his pants off and told me to go sit with him. And I told him no. I said, no. I'm like, why are we doing this? Let's just go home, take me back to my mom. He said no, that's the whole reason we went, because we were going to have some fun and he wasn't going to take me back. So remember, I sat right by the door because I didn't want to get close to him. I just sat by the door. Then he laughed and he said, do you think I won't reach over there? At the time, I didn't know what he was talking about. But I remember thinking the white stuff. I'm like, how are you going to get the white stuff all the way over here to me where I'm sitting like far from him? And then, I didn't say anything. I just thought it. And then I felt he started urinating and my legs were getting wet from his urine. And I remember I was freaking out, of course, and I was looking at my legs and he was peeing on me. And I think that's the only time I cried. I got up, I cried, and I ran to the bathroom trying to wash my legs off. There was nothing. There weren't any towels because everything had already been packed. There was no toilet paper. There was, just the water from the sink. So I remember I cupped, my hands and got water and washed my legs off. But in my head, my legs were always stained with his yellow urine. That day, it was the worst thing that I had felt because it wasn't just the abuse, but it was more of trying to humiliate me. And on the way home that day, I sat as close to the passenger door as I could without even, getting close to him. He said, when we get home, I'm going to tell your mom that you're being a bad girl and she's going to be so mad at you. I remember I was crying and I said, tell her whatever you want. I'm like, if you want to tell her, go ahead and tell her. I'm like, if she wants to send me back to live with my dad, fine. I didn't care anymore. I was just so angry that I didn't care. And of course, when we got back home and we get to my mom's, he never said a word, of course. And I walked in still crying and mad. And my mom asked me a simple question like, what do you want for dinner? Or something trivial. And I yelled at her and I, ignored her and I ran to the bathroom to go shower. When I got out of the shower, she was mad at me and she said, "Oh my God, you're so rude. You're so disrespectful. How can you be so rude to me?" And I told her, "I hate you." I said, "I hate you so much." I said, how can you do these things to me?" I said, "I hate you." And I remember I ran to my room. I slammed the door and I cried in my pillow. And, she never came in to ask what was wrong. Nobody said anything. Hours later, I came out, I told her I was sorry. We watched a movie or whatever. I just don't see how, like, if it were me and if that was my kid, I would have followed her and said, "Why are you crying? What happened?" But she didn't do that. And I don't know if she was just ignoring that it happened or if she just truly did not see that it was happening. Of course, and my mom, she's a great person. She believes that everybody is good, but I know that that's not reality. That's not really how it is. And, I tell her that's not how life is. People are not all good. So I don't think she ever knew anything until I was 12 and, the whole story came out. We never discussed it. Ever. When I was already in my mid-20s, that's when I started telling her bits and pieces about it, but I still wouldn't go into detail until I wrote the book. And I wrote the book in detail because if I got it all down on paper, it was no longer in my head. I can get it all out. It's into the world. Okay, there's embarrassing things in there, but it's out. So I'm not hiding it anymore. It's not stuck in my head. It's not on replay in my head. So before I published the book, I gave her the manuscript so she could read it and make sure she was okay with everything that was in it and so she could know the whole story. And that's when she knew the whole entire story. And she said, "Wow, I didn't know all of that was happening." And I said, "Nobody knew." My husband, I met him when I was 15 and I told him like pretty early on, I guess because I had to tell somebody. He never blamed me. He never said, "It's your fault." He never said, "Oh my God, how could you do that?" He never said anything. He said like, "I'm so sorry." After that, he was the only one I could ever talk to about it. Even to this day, I only talk to him about it. And he's like the best therapist there is, I think. So once I wrote the book, I let it all out. And that started my healing process, that started last May. So it's been about a year. Since then, I've been slowly opening up more and more. I know that if my story's out, somebody who needs to hear it will hear it. And the whole reason I even wanted to write the book was when I was 25 years old and I was struggling. My marriage had gone bad. My, house was gone. And I went to several libraries to try to find books on the topic, to try to find books that another victim had written so I could know I wasn't alone. And I didn't find any. I wanted to read from somebody like me, somebody who understood me and somebody who knew what I was going through. And I never found that. So when I wrote my book, my hope is in 10 years when the kids are being abused right now, and it's sad, but they will fall apart. In 10 or 20 years, they will fall apart. And I want these kids to be able to find my book and say, "Wow, so I'm not alone. There are other people like me." And that's the whole reason, I was so honest in the book, because I want other people to know that they're not alone. They're not the only ones going through this. And, there's 1 in 3 girls being sexually abused before the age of 18. And that's horrible. And boys too. I've read different statistics, but some are like 1 in 6, and then other places it says 1 in 12. That's horrible too. I mean, it's sad that these pedophiles get away with doing this and they don't really get punished the way they should be. Right after we moved into the home, after he urinated on my legs and we moved into the home, that's when he raped me. We were living in this home, and I rolled my eyes at him and he raped me. After that, I kind of tried to avoid him, so I never really gave him the opportunity to rape me again. So I remember I had my friends coming over almost every day. They were always there because they knew that something was going on. So I wouldn't shower unless my mom was home or my friends were there with me, because he would go into the shower or go into the bathroom. And I remember, because I still freak out sometimes, I would be in the shower and he would walk in and he would try to put his hand through the shower curtain and grab me. And it wasn't even sexual at that point. It was just taunting me. He just wanted to grab something to show that he won. Now, remember, I would have my arms, like on one side, tried to close the shower curtain, and then on the other side, tried to close the shower curtain so he couldn't get his hand in, but he still would. Well, when he would shower, he would intentionally forget to take his towel or forget to take soap or forget to take something, and he would yell for me to go and take it to him. If my mom was home, she would be cooking or something, and she would tell me, go and take him a towel. I would try to just walk in, put the towel on the sink and leave. But then he would always say, why don't you get in with me? Like, nobody will even know, like, just get in with me. And I would say, no, I don't want to, like, I'm leaving. And that's when he would splash water in my face, call me, you're nothing but a baby. I don't know why you can't just grow up and just, have fun like we used to. You always have to be a little. But when I would leave the bathroom, my face would be wet with water. And that's when my friends noticed, why is she walking out with her face wet? And why is her face red? Because I would always, every time I get nervous or embarrassed, I get red. And she would say, why is her face red? And why is she all wet? Every time she comes out, like there's something going on. So they came over more often because they knew that something was going on. And they knew that if they were there, that would happen less. So during my researching of my book, I started learning about trauma and how trauma and PTSD affects the body. So there's stress responses, which is fight, flight, and freeze. So when you're being traumatized or you're going through a traumatic event, usually your body will make high, cortisol and adrenaline. And then once the threat is over, your levels go back to normal. But when the trauma is constant, like with abuse, your levels never really go back to normal. They stay elevated because you're always in a threat. Everybody is a threat. Everybody around you is a threat. You don't know who you can trust. You don't know who you can't trust. And you always feel like you have to have your guard up. So I'll be on immunosuppressants for the rest of my life just to keep my immune system in check, because my immune system just goes out of whack because of the constant trauma as a kid. So it does cause, there's several autoimmune issues. With mine, it happens to be my liver, but there's like a million, autoimmune issues that you can get from constant childhood trauma. What I would like to say for any victims who have suffered child abuse is that you are not alone and you're no longer a victim. You survived the trauma. You survived the abuse. You are stronger than you think you are. And growing up, people would say it's not your fault, but I still believed it was my fault, because how could I be so weak to allow this to happen? But now I know it was not my fault. It was never my fault. So we should never put the blame on ourselves when the blame belongs to somebody else. So like with me, I kept the secret for so many years because I felt it was my secret that I had to keep. But in reality, it was his secret. And I don't feel like I should be keeping his secret anymore. And that's why I feel like other survivors need to talk about it, because that will release the secret into the world, but that will also bring healing and peace into their hearts and their minds. So speaking about it is probably the most important thing to healing.